Hello and welcome to Unacademy. In this session, we'll try to understand the history questions of GS Paper 1. But before we do that, remember that the 19999 offer is live right now with 12 months extension. You use this opportunity to join the Unacademy family. Thereafter, when we talk about the GS Paper 1 questions of history, I would say that the level is easy to moderate. Meaning, last time it was easy. This time it is easy to moderate, with two questions being the problem. One in art and culture and the other one being in post-independence, if we can call that question a question of post-independence. See, there was one question explicitly out of modern India, Jotiba Phule. Then art and culture, the allocation has increased this time, 3 questions, out of which one question was difficult, the Chandela one, the Chandela art forms. This is an area which we do discuss, but nobody expects a question out of this area. Then world history, easy. French Revolution, if you've done the marathon, if you've gone through Conquer Mains, if you've done my classes, it will be very easy to manage the contemporary relevance of French Revolution. And post-independence has 2 questions. One is the challenges which we face after independence. That is an easy one. But the second question, the civil services question, is not really a post-independence question. It is a governance question, GS Paper 2 question or GS Paper 4 question, but it was somehow pushed into this paper. That makes, you can say, it is off-putting for a candidate, off-putting for an aspirant to have a GS Paper 2 type question in GS Paper 1, but I'll tell you how to manage that. So the overall verdict is very simple. You have 7 questions, out of which 5 are easy to moderate and 1 from art and culture, I would say, is a bouncer. You will find it difficult. And 1 is post-independence, which is an, you can say, ambiguous and random question which came. Now, you should also understand one thing. Post-independence and world history have held their relevance for the examination. People tend to, or aspirants tend to, ignore world history and post-independence, but you can't. UPSC has either overcorrected or corrected itself in that regard, and therefore post-independence and world history cannot be ignored. So let's try to analyze each of these questions. I'll give you a model structure, a model answer, what the examiner would have expected from you. This is one of the easiest questions, something which I teach in Conquer Mains, in the class, even it is in the courseware on Indian history. If you actually have studied Indus Valley Civilization, this question should not be very difficult. Discuss the salient features of Harappan architecture. Should be answered in 150 words. Here you have too much to write. You have to control your urge. 10 marks. Now, very easily, introduction should be historical context. In this, you have to discuss that there was a Bronze Age civilization during 2600 to 1700 BCE as its mature phase. It is known for its very urban and modern features, and these are the salient features of the architecture. Very simply, in the body, we will first discuss citadel and the concept of lower town. In this, we'll basically use the word town planning. This is a very important feature of the Indus Valley Civilization. Then we'll talk about grid pattern, the concept that there is 90-degree roads. We will thereafter discuss the concept of drainage, the concept of sewage, and this will go under the concept of water management. Then we can further add points related to great bath, the fire altars, the concept of granaries. These are, you can say, specific structures of the Harappan civilization. We can then also talk about houses, the structures. But one thing which will give you an edge in this question is a diagram. So if you can show upper town, you can show grid pattern, you can show the courtyard, you can show the privacy concept, you can talk about toilets, you can talk about the drainage. multiple points can go through. This is the easiest, and you will then conclude by saying that these features are equivalent, maybe also absent in multiple different, you can say, setups or cities today where we have proper town planning. Easy question, not something out of the box, easy that ways. So this question, everybody should have been delighted. First question also. Thereafter, you get a question which is very interesting. Examine the main aspects of Akbar's religious syncretism. Now you will say to me, sir, you have always said that medieval does not come in the mains examination. UPSC has been playing with this idea for now at least 2 years that it is pushing medieval and ancient. But UPSC will very simply argue this is part of art and culture. And if any student has listened to experts that you should never read medieval ancient, does not come in the examination, do modern and art and culture, this is why I say you have to read ancient and medieval. In class we talk about Akbar's religious policy, though the NCERT has removed this section, but UPSC still is asking questions on it. Akbar's syncretic policy, Deen-e-Ilahi, Tawhid-e-Ilahi, Sulekul, whatever it may be, is part of religion. Religion means art and culture, and therefore this question is not of medieval. Do not take this as a question of medieval. That is not the nature of the question. It is art and culture, which is religion, art and culture. Now, in the introduction, because it's 150, you don't really have to worry about it too much. In the introduction, we'll talk about Akbar, how Akbar after 1560s started to change his understanding when he came out of the regency of Bairam Khan and Mahamanga, and by 1575-80 he had gone into a new zone where he wanted to change the perception of the state and at least his rule in that regard. Then in the body there are multiple things to write. It says examine the main aspects. Main aspects mean you have to talk about mazhar and infallibility decree, which is the concept of Imam Adil, and that he is the both the religious and the political leader of Muslims in India. Then obviously you have to talk about Sulekul, and under Sulekul you have to talk about Deen-e-Ilahi, and thereafter you also have to talk about how he had the Ibadat Khana and how he wanted to understand what is religion. Now this is not the right chronological order of this, but this is the chronological order of what he did. First he stopped the prisoners from converted to Islam, then pilgrimage tax, then jizya, then Ibadat Khana, then infallibility decree, then Deen-e-Ilahi, and then vegetarianism. Now, this is the overall picture. Obviously, you can't write all of these points in 150 words. So, you have to privilege jizya, you have to privilege infallibility decree, you have to privilege Deen-e-Ilahi, which basically together becomes Sulekul, and you have to talk about Ibadat Khana. Any other point you can then push into the conclusion by saying that other than this, there was also a certain emphasis on Rajput policy and how he never used to convert any of his Rajput princesses, and there is a lot to write. See, what UPSC has done is that it has asked a question which is pure mains, 250 word, 300. It's basically a optional question. And this time, I think the same has happened in history and in geography, where a lot of optional type questions have come through. This is a very standard optional question of history, and therefore they have asked an optional question in the name of art and culture, religious syncretism. Syncretism means his policies which were known by the people with love and how he changed the perception of the Mughal state. So interesting question. Again, any platform, if you've ever listened to any medieval India lecture of mine, I have discussed this in a lot of detail. You must have struggled to write, or rather struggled to write in the given, you can say, word limit in that regard. Interesting. Now, the next question, this one is an art and culture question, which is difficult. It is not difficult because it is art and culture, it is difficult because of this word. The sculptors filled the Chandela art form with resilient vigor and breath of life, elucidate. Elucidate means examples. This is where the students are actually going to struggle. Now you will say, sir, have we done Chandela? In a way you do it, but you don't know it. See, Chandela art form means early medieval. First time early medieval art and culture has been touched. Second, it talks about sculptors, not sculption, which is the men and women who created the temples and the sculpture, or you can say tradition of sculptors. So basically this question is asking you about Chandela art form. It is asking you about how the different structures were created. Now the other word is vigor and breath of life. Now these are again big words. The simple straightforward point is you have to discuss the examples and features of Chandela art form. Now you will say, sir, but we have not done Chandela art form. You don't know, but you do Khajuraho school of Nagara style. And the first thing which we discussed there is who created it. The Chandelas did. If you know Gujra, Pratihara and tripartite struggle art forms, you again are talking about the same period and the same concept in that regard. So therefore, when we talk about sculptors and Chandela, we are basically talking about the whole complex, the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Khajuraho, the Lakshmana Temple, the Kandariya Mahadevi Temple, multiple temples in that complex together, therefore. Now, what are the aspects which we now need to emphasize on? Now, this question is totally subjective and conditioned by how you read it. The sculptors filled the Chandela art form with resilient vigor and breath of life elucidate. Basically, you've discussed the features. Now, we know that the main site is Khajuraho, UNESCO World Heritage Site. We know that Khajuraho is known for Nagara style. So you can talk about how the best example of Nagara style is Khajuraho, be it Panchayatan, be it raised platform, be it Mandapa, be it Ardh Mandapa. And you can talk about Nagara style and its representation, how it shows vigor, how it shows breath of life. Then you can talk about within that the eroticism, the erotic theme of Khajuraho, where the concept of sculpture was linked to eroticism and therefore sensuality. The concept of exquisite detail, the depiction of divine and the mundane. And basically, you can talk about sculptors, you can talk about the concept of temple architecture and marry both of them. Now, to be very specific, you have to give the example of Khajuraho, you have to give the example of Lakshmana Temple, of the Kandariya Mahadeva Temple. This is the elucidate part. This is the elucidate part. Again, a question which you could expect in history, optional, not here. But I have given you the points here, which you can use for the examination or for model answers. You have to talk about the postures, for example, the Tribhanga position, the dancing apsaras in that regard. We can talk about divine power being represented for vigor. We can talk about how the Puranas and the Kama Sutra is represented. Then we can talk about the female form, naturalism. So again, this answer will vary from aspirant to aspirant because it does not have a set answer. UPSC has started to ask questions from periods. Previously, they have gone Gupta and Chola quite a lot. Last year, it was Pallava. Now we can see a pattern, which is that early medieval dynasties and medieval dynasties are something which UPSC wants to touch. We then further can add the points related to the holistic nature of how artisans, courtesans, everybody is represented, the eroticism, fertility, everything. So therefore, see, this is a difficult question. I will not discount your understanding for this. We do it, but we do it in an indirect form. And if you are able to write an answer for this, and you are integrating Nagara style, you are integrating the concept of eroticism, then you are still in the mix. Nobody will write a perfect answer for this question because you don't expect a question out of this area as it is. and because it is elucidate and 150 words, you're saved by 150 words. If you can write all the main points, you are sorted. Now, let's move to the next question, which is equally interesting. Now, this question is a post-independence question, if I want to call it one. If I want to call it one. The ethos of civil service in India stands for combination of professionalism with nationalistic consciousness. Now, people will see this word and say, okay, modern India. But see, neither is it a post-independence question, or neither it is a modern India question. This is pure GS paper 2 governance question. But because it has been asked in GS paper 1, now we are stuck with this question. Does not really fall into society, does not fall into history properly, but now we have to break it down properly. Ethos of civil services in India stands for combination of professionalism. So we have to give example of professionalism and how nationalism or nationalistic consciousness impacts the civil servants. Now, in the introduction, obviously, we're going to talk about how the ICS was a colonial body. It was dominated by the priorities and the principles of the colonial state. And thereafter, once we got independence, it needed professionalism and already had a lot of nationalistic consciousness because of the CDM, civil disobedience, or Quit India. And by the 1940s, the ICS was not an institution which the British even used to trust. Therefore, we will now divide into two parts: professionalism and nationalism. Professionalism and nationalism. So when we talk about professionalism, how after independence professionalism was introduced? It became a merit-based recruitment. Though open competition was there since 1922, but after independence, the UPSC made sure that only merit prevails. Thereafter, we'll talk about how the institution was based on or biased towards the British. It was then made impartial. Then we'll talk about how accountability has been introduced through RTI, through citizen charters, through the different rules and regulations which have been brought in, through Lokpal. Then we'll talk about the AIS conduct rules which were introduced in 1968 so as to introduce more professionalism. On a day-to-day basis, there are multiple programs, be it Karam Yogi program, multiple programs which try to introduce this ethos of professionalism. But does the ICS also have the ethos of nationalism? Yes, because they believe in unity in diversity, what the constitution wanted, what the whole national movement was about. It is then nation building, service to people, and removing colonial challenges. When the police, when the ICS was inherited by the post-colonial state, this is something which we discuss in post-independence challenges, the institutions part. The ICS and the police was geared towards the British. They were made more impartial. They were changed so that they could be real civil servants, servants of the people, service to the people. The idea that we now needed to introduce structures where community policing comes through, not the concept of just catering to the colonial state in that regard. Therefore, nation building and the role that the steel frame needed to be reformed to make the steel frame of a post-colonial state. Now, here again, you will not have any random standard, meaning you can't write, everybody will write a different answer in how they approach it. But two different, you can say, sections are needed where you're talking about professionalism and you're talking about nationalism. Both have to be talked about. Though I would agree with all of you that this is not a question of history, neither society, it's a question of governance. But because it has been given in GS paper 1, you would have to write an answer where you would then have to give examples for both. Elucidate has now been used thrice. They want examples. Me and Mukesh sir, when we were discussing the paper, we realized one thing, and he will also discuss that aspect with you, that this time the paper looks easy, but it is difficult because you need a lot of examples. And with examples, the paper becomes a little bit tricky because you may know the larger idea, but you may not know the examples. Then, beautiful, easiest, only modern India question, which is Jotiba Phule's writings and efforts of social reform touched issues of almost all subaltern classes discussed. Now, this word is now very common. It's a history optional word. Again, the Ranjit Gua movement of subalternism. You should know subaltern means the vulnerable, the down up concept, wherein the women, the Dalits, the depressed classes, you can say workers, peasants, they all called together subaltern nationalism, subaltern, you can say group. Now it says, how did Jotiba or Jotiba Phule effect or his ideas touch the issues of subaltern? Very easy. Part of social reform movement, depressed classes movement, you will talk about in the introduction. Yeah, Jotiba Phule was one of the pioneers, the one who started the depressed class movement, how his own discrimination in turn led him to start a movement where he also coined the word Dalit. And then it is saying how his writings and efforts. Now, writings list is very long, but if you are talking about Gulamgiri and if you're talking about the Sarvajanik Satyadharma Pustak, if you're talking about these two or even Gulamgiri, you are sorted. Thereafter, now you have to discuss how his ideas affected subalterns or what issues he did. So it's a very long list, very easy question to answer. How he talked about girl and women education. So the first class which he touched through his writings was women's education, girl child education. So women as a subaltern was touched. Then Dalit, untouchability, and his whole movement was about the anti-Brahmanical movement, as it is called, the idea that the domination of the subaltern by the high caste is something problematic. So Dalit and untouchability. You can talk about Satyashodak Samaj. Then how he had a certain home for pregnant women of high caste. So therefore, women again come into context. He then again talked about widow remarriage. And because most of the workers and the peasants were lower caste, therefore, anything which he wrote or his efforts, be it education, be it the movement which he started, be it the literature he wrote, everything was geared. I give this trick to all my students in class that if in social reform movement, there's a template. The reformists have certain agendas which is common to all. The revivalists have a certain agenda which is common to all. The depressed classes also have, depressed class movements have a common theme. If you remember that common theme, that is the body, then you just change the context according to who the personality is. Again, not a very difficult question, but here, because students get overwhelmed by this section, you just have to keep your cool, write it down. It is 250 words, so you have enough words to use, therefore. Now, trace India's consolidation process during early phase of independence in terms of polity, economy, education, international relations. This is a theme which we discussed in post-independence, which is called post-independence challenges or post-partition challenges. Now they've already given you the heads: polity, economy, education, international relations. So in the introduction, very simply, we will talk about how India did not get independence in a very easy environment. India got independence with partition, which created political challenges. India got independence in the Cold War politics, which again created international relations-based challenges. India was looted, therefore there are economic challenges. And because the education system was geared to only give or privilege the education part, or the fact that it was an indoctrination methodology, we needed reforms in every places. And we now have to discuss the process or the examples, trace how things change. So here you can give n number of examples. For example, in political, first issue was reintegration of princely states plus partition, which was a humanitarian challenge. Then how our constitution came into being after 2 years of deliberation, the Constituent Assembly and its challenges. Then we'll talk about how the first general election introduced a concept which was extremely revolutionary for India, which is universal adult franchise. And then till 1956, we were still reorganizing based on linguistic politics. Economy, if you actually look at it, we were an economy which was subservient. It was only serving colonial interests. So we will talk about land reforms, the concept of having a planned economy economy, planning commission, the idea that we needed the public sector, we needed development infrastructure. You can give n number of examples here in that regard. Thereafter, you can talk about higher education, how we had education commissions, we had Kothari Commission, again something which you do in governance and society. Then the higher education, primary education, how we changed our perception, how scientific development started. And obviously, in the international relations concept, you have to talk about NAM, you have to talk about the Cold War politics, you have to talk about how we were the pioneers in remaining non-aligned in a world which was divided into two powers. And conclude by saying that all of these actions had a bearing on how India is today and what it is today in that regard. Now, this was a question which you expect in the examination, but students tend to leave this for some reason, which is French Revolution, enduring relevance to the contemporary world explained, meaning French Revolution and its ideas have relevance to the contemporary world explained. Very easy question. In the introduction, you have to obviously talk about the historical context. The historical context being that in 1789, there was a revolution which started on the basis of long-term issues in France. Enlightenment, the American Revolution in turn had a cascading effect, and therefore the French Revolution introduced certain ideas which are still relevant today. Now, you just divide into ideas. First, you talk about the concept of liberty and the concept of civil liberty. You can talk about how the Enlightenment ideas of separation of state and religion, the concept of having a social contract with the state, the idea that the religion and state should be different, the idea of secularism, all of it has relevance today. Just keep on saying that in every point. Then the concept of fraternity. Fraternity was an idea which came up for the first time. It was not something which was talked about in the American Revolution, but the French Revolution. Fraternity was based on the idea of how people have to be together. Our preamble mentions it. And most of the concept of political nationalism is something which is still today there and in a way spreading across the world today. Then we can talk about the Declaration of Right of Man and Citizen. It is the mother of all constitutions. The ideas of the fundamental rights in India, the idea of freedom of speech, the expression, the idea that civil servants are accountable to the people, everything comes from here and is still relevant in that regard. So, liberty, Enlightenment ideas, the concept of, you can say, fraternity, Declaration of Right of Man and Citizen. You can talk about republicanism. The Jacobean idea of republicanism, the first idea which was introduced in the American Revolution first, but thereafter was made mainstream by the Jacobeans in that regard, was something, again, left and right politics. The word left and right came up in the French Revolution. Whatever you can think of, it's a good 250 words. You can easily answer this question. Now, this was the 7th question which came out of history. 7 questions of history. How do we look at it? What is, you can say, what is the takeaway for a student who's going to give the examination next year? Post-independence, can we ignore it? No. Post-independence has to be learnt now. Can world history be ignored? No. You have to take care of the idea that post-independence world history, even if you do the basic classes of mine, whatever 14 classes of world history and the 5-6 classes of post-independence we do, that is more than enough in that regard. Thereafter, art and culture is now including ancient and medieval. Therefore, what was obviously a very standard given concept, that art and culture is nothing but ancient medieval art and culture, it is now becoming more and more obvious, cannot ignore it. Thereafter, modern India somehow lost 2 questions. One question, social reform movement. After a very long time, it has repeated itself. Maybe next year it may not remain relevant, but a question which was manageable, they could have given any random person also. So, if I look at all the questions together, one thing is very clear, conceptual clarity is very important. There will always be bouncers, you should know how to manage it. Sticking to a good source, be it classes, be it the coursework in history, be it any other source you're referring to, is important. And you have to make sure that you're not just having factual knowledge, because any student who has only factual knowledge will struggle in this type of paper. You have to talk about the examples, to prove the examples you talked about theory. It's a marriage between theory and facts together, and therefore the use of the word subaltern itself shows a shift in UPSC understanding. I hope as a student who's been referring to, you can say, the Unacademy platform, you found these questions easy. And if you have the course in history, that one-stop solution which I have written, it also gives you an understanding. It also gives you a source where everything comes together. Don't be put off or don't chase the questions related to, for example, the Chandelas. That question is an anomaly, but you still do Chandelas. You don't know that. Thank you. Take care. And Mukesh sir will join you very soon with the analysis of geography.